So I'm pleased to be talking to you all today about harmful algal blooms in Florida. And before I do, I want to sort of set this foundation for this topic and talk a little bit about what algae are. So algae are aquatic, plant-like organisms. Like plants, they're capable of photosynthesis, but they lack many of the defining features of plants that we normally think of, such as true roots or leaves. And they are extremely diverse, encompassing a variety of simple structures from those single-celled phytoplankton that float in the water that you can really only see with the use of a microscope, to those larger seaweeds, which we refer to as macroalgae or large algae, which most of the time are attached to the ocean floor with what we call holdfast, since again, they don't have true roots. They are primarily aquatic, and they can be found in most aquatic, if not all aquatic, ecosystems, including oceans, lakes, rivers, ponds, and even in snow. So basically anywhere on Earth you can find algae. But because they need light in order to photosynthesize, algae primarily live near the surface or in clear waters where enough sunlight can penetrate to power that photosynthesis. When we're talking about harmful algal blooms, we oftentimes also talk about cyanobacteria, and they're sort of captured in this larger framework of harmful algae, although cyanobacteria are not algae at all. They are, in fact, photosynthesizing bacteria. So like algae, they do photosynthesize, but they are actually bacteria. And they are morphologically and ecologically diverse, also found in freshwater, saltwater, and can even be found in soils and in extreme environments. They have the distinction of being the oldest known fossils, more than 3.5 billion years old, and they are essentially ecological. So they are responsible for generating the oxygen atmosphere that we know of. They're also responsible for today's plants. So essentially, about 1 to 2 billion years ago, the organelles that conduct photosynthesis originated through endosymbiosis from cyanobacterium. They're important in the nitrogen cycle. So essentially, life as we know it on Earth can be due in part to cyanobacteria. So in general, algae, including the cyanobacteria, which are more commonly referred to as blue-green algae because of those pigments that they have that are able to photosynthesize, they're ecologically essential. Again, they're responsible for the oxygen atmosphere that we have today and continue to produce about 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. They're responsible for carbon sequestration, again, through photosynthesis, but also because they're aquatic, they're responsible for capturing a lot of that carbon and then transporting it upon death and decay to the deep ocean. They are the primary production of the aquatic food web. So you can see in this map produced by NASA how much productivity in the Earth's oceans are due to algae and phytoplankton. And then they're also responsible for nutrient and pollutant removal, which is a benefit that we often don't think of. So today's talk is on harmful algal blooms. So what do we mean by algae blooms? So in general, an algae bloom is the rapid and substantial increase in algae biomass in an aquatic system. And this happens fairly regularly in aquatic systems and is not necessarily indicative of something going wrong in that aquatic system. A harmful algal bloom is an algal bloom or an increase in that rapid biomass that produces either toxic or harmful effects on human health or aquatic ecosystems. So scientists really don't have a huge understanding of how many species of algae there are on Earth. We're constantly learning about new species, but it's estimated that there are about 30,000 to 1 million species of algae. And only approximately 300 of those are considered to be harmful, and of that, 100 are toxic. So to sort of summarize harmful algal blooms can be either planktonic, meaning that the algae floats in the water column and is at the mercy of the currents for dispersal, or they can be benthic, meaning that they live and are attached to the bottom of clear waters. They can be phytoplankton, so these microscopic plankton, or they can be macroalgae, these really large algae that are primarily attached to the bottom through these holdfasts. They can be toxic, they can be non-toxic, or it depends, because there are some toxin-forming algae that don't always produce toxins, and you can't tell just by looking at an algae whether or not it is toxic. So again, there's estimated 30,000 to 1 million species of algae. They're extremely diverse. And when we talk about cyanobacteria within that scope, just to understand how diverse and complicated it is, humans are more closely related, evolutionarily related to slime molds than cyanobacteria are to algae. So when you're talking about understanding and managing harmful algal blooms, it can be extremely complicated. That being said, for all of those species, there are really 4 main factors that determine growth. And that's because, again, they are photosynthesizing organisms. So sunlight, they need sunlight in order to photosynthesize, and higher light promotes faster growth. They need nutrients, and these can be within the aquatic system or external nutrients that get transported into the aquatic system, usually through rainfall events, what we call stormwater. And the more nutrients you have, just like plants on land, the more biomass you're going to have. Temperature, because even though many algae can be found in cold and even extreme temperatures, warmer temperatures do promote faster growth. And then you need time. So by definition, an algal bloom is that accumulation of biomass. So you need time within that aquatic system for algae biomass to actually persist. Slow moving water will constrain that algae rather than just flushing it out of the system and never allowing that biomass to form that bloom stage. So harmful algal blooms are a natural process, and they do occur in areas where human pressures don't really exist. That being said, persistent blooms may indicate an ecosystem imbalance. So what causes algal blooms is a complex mixture of chemical, physical, and biological factors that influence the occurrence of a bloom. But generally speaking, a bloom will occur when the growth factors, or those chemical, physical, biological factors that promote algal growth, are greater than those loss factors. And so some of those factors can be water clarity and water column stability, which will influence light and that time factor, circulation patterns, salinity, temperature, hydrology, climate and weather, and then biological community interactions, essentially predation or competition. Also note, some of these harmful algal blooming species have competitive traits that allow them to outcompete other algae species. So when we're talking about the marine environment, most HABs, not all, but most tend to be dinoflagellates. And when you're talking about the freshwater environment, most tend to be these blue-green algae, cyanobacteria. And here's a list of competitive traits. This doesn't mean that all harmful algal blooming species have all of these traits, but these are traits that do tend to persist within these bloom-forming species. So even though they are plant-like organisms, some can be mixotrophic, which means that they can actually eat other organisms. They have the ability to move. Again, even though they are algae, they have the ability to move up and down the water column. So dinoflagellates, as the name suggests, have a flagella, and that allows them to vertically move up and down the water column. And cyanobacteria have a gas vacuole, which allows it also to constrain and contract oxygen to, again, move up and down into the water column. capitalizing on sunlight during the day and the food source or nutrients on the bottom of the waters during night. They can form cysts or resting cell stages, as you can see here. So when temperatures aren't optimal or when sunlight isn't optimal, such as in cold season, they can actually go dormant in sediments. They can reproduce either asexually or sexually. The ability to fix nitrogen, which means that that nutrient component, they can actually take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and convert it to a biologically usable form. So if there's nitrogen, which is one of the major nutrients that's required for plant growth, if it's not available in that aquatic system, some of these, especially the cyanobacteria, actually have the ability to take that available nitrogen from the atmosphere. And many of them, when you're talking about those loss factors or competition and predation, many of them are simply unpalatable. So they don't taste well to those larger species, such as fish, or that would otherwise eat them. So allowing them often to outcompete other beneficial algae in the system. So they are harmful algal blooms, which means that they're going to have those human health or other environmental impacts. When we're talking about most harmful algal blooms, especially those that persist within the marine environment, for the human health component, we often refer to them from the syndrome that they impact on humans through the consumption. And the consumption can be either through contaminated shellfish or fishery species. And so you can see that although harmful algal blooms are dispersed globally, the prominent or the types of harmful algal bloom and the syndrome that they cause are not found equally across the globe. And there are also, so in addition to the consumption of contaminated shellfish or fish, some of them, such as the red tide dinoflagellate that we have here in Florida, through the inhalation of that toxin, it can cause respiratory irritation. There can be exposure through swimming or recreation in harmful algal waters. And then there's also, especially for those freshwater cyanobacteria species, the risk of exposure through contaminated drinking water or through irrigation and agricultural plants and crops that have been irrigated with contaminated waters. Here in Florida, fortunately, most of our drinking water comes from groundwater sources, not surface waters. And surface waters, again, because of the sunlight, those are the ones that tend to be impacted by cyanobacteria blooms. And so drinking water contamination, which is a huge concern in many parts of the country and globe, is an impact that we don't often experience here in Florida. There are also wildlife and ecosystem impacts. So some of these are directly related to the toxins themselves that can cause fish kills. Oftentimes it can be as a result of low dissolved oxygen. So if you can see here on this left-hand side, this is a picture of a brown tide, a species that impacts the coast of Texas as well as the Indian River Lagoon. This is a non-toxin forming species, but you can see the concentration of algae cells are so large that it completely shades out all the sunlight. And upon death and decay, essentially, you end up having sort of these low or no oxygen events. You also, as a result of that high biomass, essentially it creates turbid environments. So it prevents sunlight from penetrating down into the water column. So other plant-like organisms that rely on photosynthesis to grow, such as other more beneficial algae or seagrasses that are often found on the bottom of these aquatic environments, they'll die because they're shaded out. And so they no longer have sunlight to grow, thus sort of building off of that low or no oxygen environment. That in turn can also result in fish kills. Other ecosystem impacts can be some of those benthic algae can smother or outcompete those beneficial habitats. This is a macroalgae that's smothering a coral reef. And then you have those cascading impacts like we're experiencing on the east coast of Florida, primarily in the Indian River Lagoon. We're currently in the midst of an unusual mortality event. And again, that's an ecosystem cascade that has started from a negative brown tide harmful algal bloom event that is responsible essentially for the complete decline or collapse of seagrass habitats in the Indian River Lagoon. Seagrass is the primary food source for the manatee, and because their food source has essentially collapsed in that system, they're going through a starvation period, and we've had thousands of manatee mortalities over the last couple of years. And then, of course, there's that socioeconomic impacts associated with them. So as you can imagine, just cleanup costs. You can see here on the top, this is sargassum, which is one of the few planktonic or floating macroalgae in the world. And this, over the last decade or so, we've been experiencing huge sargassum blooms in the Caribbean that are causing major problems to tourism, business, and small island nations. And the cleanup costs alone have been estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, for those freshwater drinking supplies, you can have water supply impacts. Most of us are familiar with the Toledo, Ohio drinking water supply impacts that happened a couple of years ago. Closures to fisheries due to either shellfish harvesting areas that have to be completely closed down due to the presence of these toxin-forming algae, or because of death or mortality associated with the toxins themselves in finfish species. There are those human health costs, and then those, again, cascading economic impacts such as declines in coastal property values. So one of the questions that we often get is, are algal blooms getting worse? And there's a couple ways to look at this. This is a map that comes out of the National Harmful Algal Bloom Office. And this is one type of harmful algal bloom syndrome, paralytic shellfish poisoning. And you can see that from the 1970s compared to 2017, the number of recorded PSP cases has exponentially increased. But there are a couple of reasons for this, and it's not just PSP. You can see this is a map, a similar map of various harmful algal blooms, species and syndromes for the United States. And you can see since pre-1972 in the bottom and the present day, you can see again the incidence in the type and location of these blooms has increased. So what is the reason for these increases? Some of those increases can be attributed to climate change. So we are experiencing those warmer waters, which again promote algal growth, and more severe weather. So when we're seeing wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons, that sort of amplifies 2 or 3 of those 4 major growth factors. When you have droughts, happens with those nutrients on land as they get sort of concentrated in the soils and in the sediments. And then when we have those wet season, those flash floods, rather than having it allow us slowly percolate through and get treated through the natural system, it all gets flushed into those downstream aquatic systems. So you get these massive, large pulses of nutrients delivered to the downstream aquatic systems. You get large nutrients, warmer waters, promoting growth. There, as you know, human populations continue to grow, and especially around coastal areas, we have more human introduced nutrients. But it's also important to recognize that some of this increase in occurrence is also due to the way we collect that data. So we have more robust monitoring and detection, which means that we're able to detect harmful algal blooms and toxins at a scale, both spatially and temporally, better than we were previously, especially prior to the 1970s. So we're just detecting them more. But an interesting way to show sort of this increase in HAB occurrence is through the number of news reports. So this is national news reports of algal blooms. And what you can see is that, there sort of was a steady number of cases in the previous decade, but since 2014, which is Toledo, the number of news reports about algal blooms has also increased, which indicates that perhaps the frequency of these blooms is increasing, or perhaps that general public awareness is just increasing. So I'm going to shift focus to some of the harmful algal blooms that we have in Florida. And the state of Florida monitors more than 50 harmful algal bloom species. So essentially, this is a completely simplified map of HABs in Florida. The whole point of this is just to show you that if there is a water body, be it marine, estuarine, freshwater, regardless of the scale and size, it is likely to be a host to a harmful algal bloom species. And so we have those marine dinoflagellates, we have this freshwater blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, we have that brown algae sargassum, which is the large floating macroalgae. But we have numerous other harmful algal bloom species. So why do we have so many species? Well, first of all, we have a lot of water in Florida. We have more than 4,300 miles of water, including 11,000 miles of rivers, streams, and waterways. We have a massive coastline, nearly 8,000 lakes, 700 springs, and we have artificial water bodies such as those stormwater ponds that we see in most of our communities. So we have a lot of water and a lot of warm water, which means there's a lot of opportunity for algal growth. We've also changed our land use dramatically in the state, which again influences those nutrients and that nutrient availability, which is one of those growth factors. We have a continued population growth rate in the state, which means more people, which means more human sources of nutrients. And those sources of nutrients are robust. This is just in alphabetical order, so there's really no, not trying to say which is more important or less important, but you could see that, we have nutrients that fall down on us when it rains from atmospheric deposition, from intentionally applied fertilizers, from our wastewater stream, and then stormwater. So what can we do about it? Well, the beneficial thing is, we said that one of the reasons why we're detecting more harmful algal blooms is because we have more robust and better detection of that. And in the state of Florida, that is absolutely the case. We have every state agency, basically from Department of Environmental Protection, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and Florida Department of Health that are responsible for managing harmful algal blooms in some sense. We also partner very closely with federal partners, primarily NOAA and USGS, to do harmful algal bloom monitoring and management. And collectively, the state of Florida is really trying to get what were previously disparate management actions from the various agencies working together in a more coordinated communication stream through the Protecting Florida Together website. So when you're talking about managing harmful algal blooms, there are three primary strategies. We have prevention strategies, which essentially focus on those actions that attempt to address the problem before a bloom will occur. You have mitigation, which focus on those actions that if there is a bloom, it will minimize the impacts of that bloom. And then control. So focus on those actions to suppress or eliminate a bloom after the bloom has formed. Mitigation is by far and away the biggest sort of set of tools in the toolbox for mitigation, and most of our efforts land there. So we have prediction and monitoring efforts to be able to sort of track where those harmful algal blooms are, where those toxins are and how toxic they are, as well as outreach and education to be able to minimize the human health impacts. So detecting shellfish harvesting areas and closures, and then promoting that to commercial and recreational fishers. Being able to detect where toxins in freshwater bodies are and putting signage out there so that the public doesn't recreate near those areas. And the same for some of our marine species, being able to detect where they are so that individuals can make the most informed decisions for themselves to be able to protect their public health. There's also other mitigation opportunities such as disaster relief funds. So back in 2018, when we had the cyanobacteria bloom in Lake Okeechobee and the Karenia brevis bloom, numerous counties were declared a state of disaster. And so there were funds for businesses that got impacted by those. Control strategies are those strategies, again, that try to reduce the bloom once it's already begun. And there are a suite of control options. And most of those are, I would say, our control strategies are best for freshwater and for smaller water bodies, because you start to get into the scale constraints of being able to physically control a bloom in really large scale water bodies, or financially be able to control that bloom. So some of those strategies revolve around disrupting the algae and making them sink down to the bottom where they are no longer able to capture sunlight, and then they'll die. Actually physical removal of those vacuum services, using vacuum services, or things like algicides. You know, they are plant-like, and in fresh waters, there are some algicides that you can apply. So again, there's a suite of control options, and these are best for those systems where you have low flowing water, such as in a canal or in a marina. The last is prevention, and this is through survey work. We know that this is the most preferred strategy, but it's also one of the hardest. But it can be done at all scales, from national scale to the individual scale. And generally speaking, when you're looking at those 4 growth factors, so sunlight, nutrients, temperature, and time, the 2 that we can really try and adjust to prevent the growth of harmful algal blooms is time to some extent, which is what you see on that bottom, manage hydrological modifications and operation schedules. But more often than not, it's the nutrients component. And so reducing those nutrient inputs and supporting best practices, again, so actually applying less to minimize those downstream effects of nutrients. But even though we sort of have these 3 main strategies, prevention, mitigation, and control, it's really important to remember that harmful algal bloom dynamics are complex. When you're talking about harmful algal bloom species, you're talking about algae and cyanobacteria, which are extremely different and diverse. And so HAB species, their development, their life cycles, their toxicity, and their impacts, as well as how you manage those, are not one size fits all. And so we can't look at a single water body and assume that if we were able to prevent harmful algal blooms here, that is a strategy that can be applied across the board. Every single harmful algal bloom and every single water body that's impacted really needs its own unique solution to be able to address these issues. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank Yilin for inviting me here today, and I will take any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. That's very informative. I just put in the chat box. If anyone have any questions, you can just leave in the chat box. While you are typing your questions, because as I mentioned in the beginning, this webinar is hosted on Zoom, and we also broadcast to Facebook. I do have a question here on Facebook. So just ask blue-green algae. It seems like it happens more often in fresh water. Do they also happen a lot in marine, like coastal areas?
Yeah, there are some cyanobacteria that do exist in marine and coastal areas, but you are absolutely correct. They are more commonly found in freshwater systems. But for example, Florida Bay gets impacted by a cyanobacteria that's called Synechococcus. Some of you who follow red tides might be familiar with Trichodesmium. That's a cyanobacteria that happens in the marine waters and isn't harmful itself, but is thought to be a contributor to the occurrence of red tide blooms, which we do know to be harmful. And then the Indian River Lagoon is also impacted by a type of cyanobacteria. So less rare, but they do occur. Sorry, less common, but they do occur.
That's good, thank you. And another question here is, do you think we can really stop algae blooms?
No, I don't. And I think that's why I prefaced in the beginning that harmful algal blooms or algal blooms are part of normal aquatic systems, and algae are beneficial. So we don't want to remove them entirely, but we do need to, I think, minimize the impacts of those harmful algal blooms, especially those that have those serious human ecosystem and socioeconomic impacts. So those are, I think, really where those efforts to try and minimize the impacts need to be focused.
Yeah, that's true. And just because we are talking about harmful algal blooms, so it's not just it's all bad. Don't forget they also have the pro side. And for our Zoom attendees, feel free to leave any questions in the chat box. So where you are typing, I do have a question for you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Because earlier you mentioned the cyanobacteria, because I remember I saw it happened quite often in the Great Lakes and really posing those risks for like the communities use surface water for their drinking water supplies. And from what I've been reading, because the threat here is toxins from the cyanobacteria. What are the most effective ways in treating, like to remove the toxins from fresh water and can still be served as a drinking water source?
Oh, I'm not going to be able to go into specifics, but it's kind of like a treatment train effect. So there are various treatment options, including ozonation, using peroxides and stuff. In terms of the drinking water, I'm not as familiar with those because fortunately it hasn't been an issue for us in Florida. But yeah, for those states that have cyanobacteria pretty regularly in their drinking water supply, that's part of their normal water supply process, is a treatment system.
Yeah, because I think it's because my understanding, most of water treatment plants they use fluorine because it's effective and it's at least it's effective and at least expensive.
Yes.
But I'm not sure how that deals with the toxins. I know for ozonation and hydrogen peroxide that they can remove, but I don't know I'm just curious, like.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the toxin. So not all
Yeah.
toxins behave the same way. So that's why it's important to know what species of cyanobacteria is blooming and what toxins it produces, and that will sort of lead to its own treatment regimen.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. All right, I think our attendees don't have any questions. I've been checking on Facebook and our Zoom. I think you addressed all the questions that they had.
Well, my email address is there if anyone has a question you want to get back to me.
And before everyone leaves, if I can, I've been struggling with my computer today. Apparently, I cannot launch the pool, but it's all right. It's a very simple question. So for whoever is watching this, if you think you have improved your knowledge about the harmful algal blooms, please just put a yes in the chat box, or you put yes on the Facebook, so we know. Actually, for Lisa, so she will have an understanding if she has addressed all your questions. So before I close,
I think I launched it for you, Helin.
Oh, awesome! Thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't see it on this screen. Perfect. So I know for our Facebook attendees, you cannot see it, but for Zoom attendees, if you can just take a second to tell us if you have improved your knowledge or not. So like I said, for Facebook attendees, if you think you have improved your knowledge, just put a yes in the comment, or just give a thumbs up like our video and share with your friends. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. And thank you, Lisa, for this informative presentation. And we look forward to having you back for another Water Wednesday.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.